Hi, my name is Jerry. I'm the co-founder and CEO of LlamaIndex, and I'm super excited to be here.
Fantastic. And tell us a little bit about what LlamaIndex does.
Yeah, so LlamaIndex is a data framework for building LLM applications. The key mission is to enable you to unlock the full capabilities of LLMs on top of your own private data, whether you're an individual or an enterprise with large amounts of different types of data from structured to unstructured. And so we're really thinking about how do we provide the toolkit to allow you to manage every stage of the data lifecycle as it's kind of going into your LLM application. So this includes a few different components. So this includes ingestion, indexing, or storage, and then also the query interface and the interactions between LLMs on top of your data to fully kind of give you back the best results.
Fantastic. And so when did you kind of found the company or the project?
Yeah, so I started the project about 7 months ago. Back then, for those of you who might know, it was called GPT Index, and so started back in November. At the time, it was mostly a toolkit to help get around some context window limitations, because I think anybody building applications on top of the GPT-3 API was discovering that there were certain restrictions on being able to ingest a ton of data into GPT-3. And so I wanted to build some initial project. That project got a decent amount of interest, and so which in turn inspired me to work a little bit more on it. And it kind of just took off from there, and now it's evolved into this overall toolkit that's solving this critical need around data.
And so it was originally just kind of a personal project?
Yeah, it was like a personal GitHub project. It was like an open source thing. I thought it was fun. You know, I've always been interested in startups and entrepreneurship and AI and at the intersection of all these things. I didn't know for sure at the time I was going to create like a kind of LLM tooling based company. But that part was a little bit spontaneous. But I think a lot of the experiences I've had from like ML to research to working on like ML engineering to working in a startup experience has roughly led me to this path. And so in the end, I would say in hindsight, it makes sense.
Fantastic. And so back, end of last year, Q4, did you have the problem yourself, or were you talking to people who had how did you identify the fact that there were these limitations in GPT-3 and that there was a problem to be solved?
Yeah, definitely. So I was actually playing around with the GPT-3 API, and around late October, I was trying to build some sort of like sales bot on top of my previous company's customer conversations. Because I was in customer conversations, I would forget what the agenda was for each subsequent meeting because they were spaced out like every 2 weeks. So I wanted it to ingest customer conversation data and synthesize a to-do list for me before the next meeting. And so as I was playing around with actually doing this, that's where you actually run into some of the context window limitations where GPT-3 had 4,000 tokens. Some customer conversations per account had way more data than what could fit within the 4,000 token window. So what are strategies for both like storing this data and also retrieving this data so you could use it with your query?
Okay. And talk us a little bit about through the kind of project that you were presenting today.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess from that project, which was back in November, it's grown into this overall toolkit. And so there's basically 3 main components to LlamaIndex as it stands today. There's ingestion, there's indexing, and there's the query interface. So ingestion is how do you get data from its original format into some format and into a storage system that you can use later with LLM applications. These days, there's some initial stacks around vector databases. So you take some documents, you chunk it up, parse it, add some metadata, store it in a vector database. I did talk a little bit about storage abstractions during the talk itself. And so, we provide integrations with vector databases and also just generic key value stores and allow you to basically flexibly store different types of data in different ways. From there, there's basically ways that you can define both indexing and structures on top of the data, as well as some sort of query interface over the data. A very basic one that's emerging these days is that once you actually store document chunks in a vector database, you can do top K embedding-based retrieval and then put that into the prompt for synthesis. I think what we're thinking about is a generalization of this overall use case and really thinking about what are kind of like the overall set of queries that a user might want to run, and what are some kind of like not just simple, but also advanced retrieval strategies on top of your data. What state do you need to define beforehand to make that happen? And then how do you basically use the LLM combined with traditional machine learning information retrieval methods to give you back the most relevant information and synthesize the best results?
Fantastic. And so the kind of integration with MindsDB, how do you see that kind of benefiting, obviously, the customers and the users of LlamaIndex, and also vice versa for our kind of customers and users?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could totally see that benefiting kind of an existing user segment of data analysts that are roughly familiar with SQL. So basically, SQL is still less accessible to some people, but for some people they're very familiar with. It's a very familiar interface. And as a kind of very powerful declarative interface, the fact that right now the integration is that you can basically use the SQL interface to reference a LlamaIndex structure as a query engine, and then basically feed in LlamaIndex query engine as some sort of compute layer under the hood for certain classes of SQL expressions that you write. So for instance, you could like select star from this model and feed in a set of questions in SQL style, and then basically join this question table with the model, which is powered by LlamaIndex, and use the power of LlamaIndex to fulfill the answers to these questions and give you back the right outputs. And so I think for a lot of like data analysis use cases, I think that makes a ton of sense. And you basically get access to the advanced capabilities that we offer and can retrieve on top of your data in addition to the simple capabilities. The next layer, I think, is that in addition to catering to data analysts that know SQL, you can also cater to even like a level up, like end business users that don't quite know SQL, but just want to query with natural language. Because once you wrap a layer where you can do some sort of like natural language to SQL, and then that SQL is basically powered by kind of your very powerful declarative interface, and then which can in turn call the LLM or other predictor models, then you basically have this like full analytics engine set up. And it's like at every level of the stack, you can cater to a different audience, but in the end, it's just a very powerful thing.
Fantastic. And so what are some of the kind of unexpected ways that you've seen your users and community use kind of LlamaIndex?
Yeah, I think the most unexpected way, so like the core toolkit by itself, if you use it as a standalone thing, is really meant for kind of like data analysis tasks. Like if you do question answering over a set of documents, or do analyze financial statements, or analyze like structured data, or do some combination of both, that's kind of like what we want people to use. At the same time, what we think is like the framework really helps to solve. That said, we have seen some pretty interesting projects where people are actually using LlamaIndex constructs to kind of like build their own like agents that can interact in the world, right? Even though we don't inherently have any sort of like opinionated agent frameworks, there are some basic conveniences that we provide. For instance, we abstract away the need to worry about like context limitations. We abstract away the need to really think about kind of how do you chunk up your data and structure it and link it. And there's a certain set of primitives that we provide that are actually helpful to build just like a variety of different types of LM experiences. And so we're starting to see some like basic knowledge agent-like structures emerge using our toolkit too.
Fantastic. And what are some of the things that you're kind of working on now? Some of the things that, maybe new features or things that keep you up at night? What's
100%. I think there's just a lot of things. And so there's, I think it's more of a matter of like prioritization as opposed to just like too little things to do, if that makes sense. These days, there's, during the presentation, I gave a sense of basically some, use cases that we could solve for different types of like abstractions that we provide can better solve like different use cases. For instance, like document comparisons, like time-based queries and the like. There's just an entire class of queries that we want to continue pushing the performance boundary on. And just really thinking for this class of use cases, maybe like, for this like SEC filings or for like medical patient records, what exactly is kind of like the engineering, right? And the right interaction and the interface in order to really get you back the best results for this domain. And so I think there's just I think we're probably out of this spectrum of like the entire set of queries a user might want to run. We're probably like 50% there. And so there's just a long tail of other things that we want to solve. Beyond that, there's just like a ton of partnerships, integrations, and keeping up to date with the latest research, integrations with all the kind of like storage providers. Also starting to think about on the technological side, what sort of like agent-like behavior, which I alluded to at the talk, really makes sense for data retrieval and synthesis. Because again, that's something that we're really passionate about.
And how big is your team right now?
Right now, it's two co-founders and one full-time person. Okay. And we have a few contractors, but we're actually hiring as well. So if you're interested, shoot me an email.
Check out your website. Yeah. Fantastic. And so now kind of creating a real business, right? Started as a project,
yep.
Some point between the end of last year and now, transitioned into a real business. How was that transition, kind of, obviously you didn't expect it when you first started this, but kind of how have you found that transition to be, there's many different challenges to running a business than just kind of having a really successful GitHub project?
Oh, 100%. I think, yeah, it's kind of funny. I think basically the way it worked was it started off as a side project. And then I think if you somehow were able to plot a graph of just like the number of hours I spent on this, and like, x-axis is like the month and the year, and then y-axis is hours committed, you could probably just see like a straight line going upwards after a certain point. And maybe plateauing, because at a certain point I need like,
need sleep
some sleep per day. Yeah, I think, just on a very personal level, like, I think I've always wanted to start a company. I think this is something that has always excited me. Just the ability to like create a really cool project, have users and really try to like build some core piece of tech that like transforms, the industry. It is pretty busy, as you could imagine. And so I do think like, if you do want to start a company, you do have to kind of be like all in and really be dedicated to it. And I've kind of like rewired my brain at this point to kind of like just really just like think and just be passionate about work. And you do have to kind of manage your own timeline so that you don't like burn out, right? And that you can manage stress. But I think at the same time, it is also a very exciting experience. And I think I'm kind of at a very fortunate position where it just kind of built this project during a time when a lot of people were interested in generative AI. And I think that's something that is pretty rare, right? Because a lot of times you can have like very smart people building really cool things, and maybe the market's not the right timing. So I do think it's some combination of just like a lot of it is luck, and then some of it is just like, just executing and trying to build the things that people would want to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And how important, obviously, only 3 people, obviously expanding, but how important is kind of community in your ability to kind of keep up?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most important things, like if not the most important thing. I think the community is how we basically got here, and then the community will, growing the community is one of our top priorities for the end of this year. I think just the reason is you're starting to see some basic stacks emerging on how you use LLMs with other services. And we think that our toolkit can provide a lot of value to different types of users, whether you're kind of like a beginner who just like trying to run this on top of your collection of notes, or you're an enterprise user. And I think there's just been a lot of passion and interest from the community in using our toolkit for various types of data tasks, and we want to continue supporting them. And I think that's one of our key goals. And I think like once we feel like we've kind of like figured that out, then in parallel, in addition to the stuff we're doing, we'll start thinking about how to scale this up to enterprise. But still, like building with the community is one of the key goals that we have.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about the project or about the collaboration or anything like that?
Well, I mean, general notes, I'm super excited about like future collaborations, partnerships, integration opportunities with MindsDB. I really enjoyed this conference here today. And I think there's just a lot of exciting features coming out for LlamaIndex, both on the kind of like the agent-like behavior. Also, we're starting to think a lot more about like ingestion, indexing, like being able to index different types of data from like, semi-structured data to image data, especially as these models become more multimodal. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the last note is if you're interested in potentially, joining the LlamaIndex team or even just like hacking on some projects, just shoot me an email. We're super open to conversation.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And one last question. So obviously right now there is a huge conversation around the world about regulation of large language models, generative AI. Mm-hmm. Europe have started to propose some limitations around licensing. What are your thoughts on that? Just kind of high level generally.
Yeah, I think this is like a very broad discussion, and maybe I can kind of paint a picture of our focus area. And so parts that could be relevant and parts that we're not necessarily completely thinking about at the moment. Right now, we're like an inference type tool, right? So like you take a model that's already trained on something, and then you can apply our tool on top of this model. So we don't own the model or like the training data that the model was originally trained on. And I think there's a lot of like interesting regulations and licensing issues around like, the training data set itself, like the behavior of the model. I think the model itself is a very interesting topic because these days there's like a lot of open source models coming out, and there's a lot of concern from enterprises of depending too heavily on like a third-party provider. So, OpenAI, for instance, has like the best models probably in class right now with GPT-4. There are going to be some businesses that are a little bit wary of using this model. I think what we can provide is probably some sort of like cost analysis layer, right, as like a toolkit that can operate as a layer on top of these existing models that can basically help them decide the trade-offs. Because we can say, hey, we think this model performs like this, but you're also going to have these trade-offs of this data will be hitting like a third-party API. And we can help them make those decisions as an application toolkit.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.